if you followed these conferences before, we like to have a perspective where we bring in some of the member states supervisors. Member states is maybe not the right perspective alone, because both Jean-Paul Servais and Robert Ophèle also have prominent roles in the international standard setting bodies. In the case of Jean-Paul Servais as Vice Chair of IOSCO, and with Robert Ophèle in a prominent role in the FSB. And so we can bring both the international and the domestic perspective to the debate, which I'm very excited about. And also both are conduct regulators, and we had central banks before, and I think it's important that we now take the perspective from a market side. Good afternoon to both of you. Thanks very much for being with me. I'm very much looking forward to this session. And maybe I start with you, Robert. I think let's start on the international dimension maybe, and before we go into the domestic perspective. How do you see at the moment the work at the FSB? The FSB has been very active in the last few years, but particularly last year, around digital finance. And maybe you can kind of share a little bit how you see that work progressing at the moment.
I think it's just the beginning of a long journey, actually, in this international dimension. Financial markets are global by nature, and this is why we have a set of international standard setters, actually sectoral standard setters covering insurance, banks, securities and the like, and market infrastructure, and the FSB, which to a large extent coordinates their work. Most technology developments are actually impacting all sectors of the finance at the same time. That's the case for cloud computing, artificial intelligence, distributed ledger technologies. And even if you could have some nuances, they deserve to be treated coherently. Usually, national competent authorities are just exchanging views and experiences on this technology development in international fora, without producing new standards or any precise regulatory recommendations. And to some extent, technology in itself is actually not an issue, since regulations try to be technology neutral, provided risk associated with these technologies are properly handled. And crypto digital is of a different nature, actually. To some extent, they are like UFOs with vis-a-vis our regulatory framework. They are more just than a technology associating distributed ledger and cryptography. To some extent, they are a parallel work, a metaverse where you could find a huge variety of articles mimicking the usual ones. Are tokens commodities? Are they securities? Are stable coins cash-like, cash equivalent? Is DeFi a banking activity? International standard setters have been monitoring from far the development of the digital crypto world, since to a large extent it was not hampering the proper functioning of the financial markets and was not assessed as a menace for financial stability. Moreover, the idea of developing a regulatory framework for cryptos was often dismissed as giving them an inappropriate official legitimacy blessing. We have therefore witnessed very diverse local regulatory treatment, starting with no regulation at all, ranging up to a complete ban, and going through specific regulatory frameworks and integration in some cases, in some sectorial regulation, for example, payment or security. With such a heterogeneity is almost non-existent, which is a source of huge inefficiencies for every local approach. Fully digitalized assets and services based on decentralized software cannot be supervised on a local basis. And we were and still are, I think, clearly behind the curve in that field. But the mood has changed. And the mood that has survived the collapse of the global stablecoin project, which was triggering some reaction from in international fora. I think the crypto challenges are now being taken very seriously at the international level, and especially at the FSB, which is currently had put this issue very high on its agenda and is coordinating an ambitious work plan covering all aspects of the crypto space, which is all the more justified that you have a continuous nature of activities in this space, and they deserve to be assessed in their entirety. Actually, if you want to consider the regulatory challenges raised by cryptos at international level, I'm inclined to address them by separating coins, tokens, and services. Regarding coins, you should differentiate between the so-called stable coins, which are directly competing with bank deposits or CNAV mutual funds, and the other coins, mainly unbacked coins. Regarding services, you will have to differentiate between services provided by entities, the numerous digital asset service providers, such as custodians or trading platforms, and the services embedded in some DLTs, which can promote DeFis. They will all be reviewed by the FSB in the next few months, and I do expect that at the end, for some of them, we could have an international regulatory convergence. What I have in mind is primarily stable coins, because they are directly competing with the regulated activities and are the anchor point of DeFis, and digital asset service providers, because they are key in money laundering, cyber risks, and mis-selling cases. For a regulator, there is a universal basic principle: same service, same risk, they deserve same rules. And I do think that we could deliver on these issues in the next few quarters, because right now the FSB has put all of them very high on its agenda. Perhaps I will stop here for this introduction of what is going on in the international fora.
Thank you very much. I come back to some things because you raised some very interesting questions that we also discussed yesterday evening with the SEC and the Bank of England and the Commission and some industry players in this. But before that, maybe John Paul, over to you, also from the IOSCO perspective.
Yeah, so good afternoon, Nick and Robert, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. First of all, allow me to thank you for the invitation. It's not the first time that I have the pleasure, and I hope it's not the last time that I have the pleasure to be a speaker in your well-known conference. I think that the title of the debate between Robert and myself is the best one, because it's rightly called, I would say, how to deal with global and domestic issue and perspective. And I think it's exactly what Robert and myself and other supervisors in Europe and more generally at international are doing. I think that if we want to be successful as supervisor in order to tackle some issue, I would say from a negative, when we speak about for positive point of view, how to support financial innovation, I think there is one leitmotif that we need to take care of. It's no competition between us. The objective is not to come as a competitor against each other. I think that the question that we have to answer is to understand who is the best placed in order to perform the best supervisory and to use the best supervisory toolkit, especially when we speak about the new frontiers related to digital finance. Of course, most of the time, and it was already stressed by Robert, it will be a cross-border discussion, because we are speaking about cross-border business. Most of the time, the platform and people using cryptos are by definition fast movers. Let us be clear. So there is a question about forum shopping. Let us be clear. About risk, and also about this new dialogue, which is not new as such, but with a fantastic and incredible leverage effect. Because when we speak about crypto, when we speak about platform, it means the capacity to have a dialogue between very sophisticated people And I mean by that, I would say managers, financial actors using high-tech by definition, and then directly, most of the time, without any broker of people acting as a go-between, non-sophisticated vessel. And that's a key aspect of our job, especially when we are, I would say, member of FSMA, IOSCO, or FSB, but with a specialization related to the supervision on rule of conduct. So from this point of view, of course, discussion at global level may help avoid fragmentation, and the role of IOSCO as a standard setter, as I would say, a real global membership organization. Please don't forget that IOSCO, it's not only the FSB, the G20, it's also different kind of market, I would say the most sophisticated emerging market. So it's a rather unique venue. And most of the time, for many of the members, I would say this capacity building only exists inside the IOSCO system. And that's what we are doing at IOSCO level in order to tackle new development. We have the pleasure to work with a network, which is, I think, the first step of maybe the best approach for some aspect, especially when we speak about fintech, and that's the case because we have IOSCO fintech network. We have also ICO network, which means a capacity to have a network when we speak about digital asset offering support. I also have the pleasure to be the chair of a SPAC network. As such, it's not, I would say, a digital finance aspect, except that, of course, some marketing techniques can be the same. How to play, I would say, with many aspects, difficult aspects about possible misselling with VIP, people who are well known in the sport, in the music, but not necessarily in financial advice and sound financial advice. So there are some connections. But it's not only, I would say, the case at IOSCO level. There is also, for instance, an interesting common work stream managed by CPMI and IOSCO. And I presume that many people in the audience, if you had the pleasure to read a recent consultative report about the application of the principle for financial market infrastructure to stable account arrangement, proposing some guidance on the application of the PFMI to stable account arrangement. Cooperation, and that's maybe, Nick, something which is maybe less well known. Cooperation at international level may be helpful for very practical cases. Yes, I am very happy and even proud in my capacity as vice chair of IOSCO to stress that combat against fraud, which is also the case, of course, in crypto area, is most of the time based on cooperation agreement via IOSCO MMOU. That's something which is very powerful. Just one figure of two figures. When I had the pleasure to sign some time ago, it was 15 years ago, as chair of the FSMA, the first MMOU. At this time, the number of requests for information were very limited and only limited to classical, I would say, possible case of insider trading. That's maybe a scoop, but 15 years after, the number of requests has been multiplied by 20. So it means that the tool that we are using is very powerful. You know that speed is important, and that's the case when we use such, I would say, MMOU. Fintech development, and I will close my introductory comment with this two comment. Fintech development, it's also an area where cooperation is not only cross-border, but also cross-sector. And I stressed by Robert, it's quite normal that the FSMA is on board. First of all, we know, I would say, the role of FSB. Frankly speaking, a good idea to have the capacity to liaise with FSB, which is, of course, the body in charge of a direct, I would say, direct connection with the G20. But also, of course, the level of the FSB is also very useful and the best one, because we are speaking most of the time about cross-sector aspect, banking, market, interest authorities, all on board, and especially, and I presume that we will come back in the second part of our discussion, Nick, especially when we discuss about crypto asset, what's in a name, but which is something which is very interesting and fascinating from a customer point of view, of course. Therefore, we need to have a cross-sector approach. And also about the teams, let us be clear. It's not only about what we are doing in order to find against, I would say, possible mis-selling, misconduct, quality of information, how to support financial operation, but there are also some aspects related to privacy aspect, especially in the context of artificial intelligence. So it means, and of course, cyber security aspect, especially when we speak about operational. So it means it's a comprehensive approach. And from this point of view, of course, I would say a global approach is the best one.
Thank you very much indeed, Jean-Paul. And I like the way you described kind of the toolbox, and that it's not a competition between regulators, it's who's appropriate to do what. And we come back to some of that because one issue you both raised is kind of the exposure to the retail investor. But I think before we come to that, you're right, let's focus a bit more on the crypto side. And Robert, there's two kind of follow-up questions to just having listened to what you said. One is, it kind of struck me when you said that within a few quarters, the FSB might come with some concrete ideas, some thoughts. I don't know to what extent you could elaborate on that already, but there is a thought that the FSB remains normally relatively principles-based, relatively high level, relatively strategic, because it ultimately falls to the individual regions to then implement it. Or that the FSB gives strategic orientation and then assigns it to a IOSCO, Basel Committee, FATF, and so on to do the concrete implementation work. So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about that. And secondly, I found it very interesting because we had that discussion yesterday as well, that one of the risks around crypto assets is redeemability and liquidity. And you made the comparison just now to money market funds, CNFs. To what extent do you see some of the non-bank finance debate, what we in the past called shadow banking debate that is still live in the FSB, influencing some of the discussions around crypto assets?
That's a super shadow banking activity, actually, because we have abandoned the shadow bank naming. You're perfectly right. First of all, I mentioned we are still behind the curve because, to some extent, having a network monitoring things, that's the very first step. In some cases, we would need some harmonization in the regulatory approach of the same instrument or the same service. For example, Jean-Paul mentioned the IOSCO MMOU, which is very useful indeed, and for the international cooperation in our field. But do they cover crypto assets? It's not straightforward, for example. Depends on the way you treat them in your national legislation. So there is, and I do think you have mentioned stable coins. Are they really stable? You sell them as stable, but what's behind that? Do we need to have a regulatory framework for them, ensuring that the commitment to provide a stable instrument is really met? And if so, could we afford to have different regulatory approaches between different jurisdictions? Of course not. That's why the FSB is very closely working with the different standard setters, because at some point, in some cases, you need to go further than just that's needed for stable coins and for, let's say, for digital asset service providers, because there are the two entry points where an harmonized regulatory framework could be worth developing. If you embark in developing some regulatory approach for, let's say, unbacked coins, it will be a never-ending story, because they are so different sort of these type of instruments, and very different approaches from one country to one jurisdiction to another, that we will never deliver. But on these two approaches, which by the way are relatively key in the European approach, I do hope that at some point, after the proper analysis, the proper consultation, that's the proper development by sectoral standard setters, we could achieve something which would be a real, let's say, a real international cooperation in that field. There are many reasons why we are behind the curve. It's due to the fact that we have assessed this world not to be a danger for financial stability. But if you wait to have it grown so large to be a potential risk for financial stability, you will never be on time. That's why I think there is now that these type of issues are now very high on the agenda of our internal fora, including IOSCO, of course. But as Jean-Paul has rightly mentioned, is trans-sectoral. So that's.
No, so I think you're keeping us a little bit in suspense as to what the structure will look like, but I could imagine it'd be a combination of different bodies looking at different aspects.
Exactly. Exactly. Inside the FSB, there are several subgroups, the SCAB, the SRC, and so, and you build specific work streams, and that's. I do think that we are the FSB is going full steam on this issue.
Thank you. No, and that's encouraging, because I think the industry always welcomes international approaches over regional approaches, and it just creates legal certainty. And I think, Jean-Paul, coming to that, I think two things. One is, Europe at the moment is still, was certainly ahead on regulation of crypto assets through MiCA. Now kind of the US is starting to catch up quite quickly. But how do you see a European framework in such a global framework? How do the two things fit together? And the other one is, you made that point about assets. What are assets? What are crypto assets? The one thing I took away from last night's discussion was actually there was a consensus that 2 years ago we talked all about categorizing different crypto assets, creating a taxonomy. And then once you've had that, you put them into different boxes. Last night, the question was, no, we need an integrated regulatory framework, because different crypto assets or stablecoins interact with each other. They are dependent on each other. It's one ecosystem. So we need one framework for the entire ecosystem, which is a much more refreshing approach. But you came back to the point of defining assets. So I just throw this at you. Do you agree with this being an integrated framework, or do we have to still look at the underlying assets and build our regulatory and supervisory framework on that basis?
Well, Nick, I think that you are like me. You like lively debate, because it means democracy.
I do. That's why I do this conference, Jean-Paul. That's why I invite you, and yes, I will invite you again next year.
So it means democracy, that not necessarily everybody is in line. I am maybe not as enthusiastic as other very important and high-level speaker about the need for an integrated framework. It seems to be a good idea, but in the day-to-day practice, I'm not sure that it would be so easy to perform for different reasons. And thank you for this very, very useful question, I like. First of all, what's in a name? Crypto asset. Are we sure that the best approach is to have, I would say, a one-size-fits-all approach? I don't think so, because when we speak about crypto assets, it's a kind of catch-all word. not only from a legal point of view, but also about the business model and from an economic point of view. And it's a catch-all word that covers many different realities. And I still think that it's important to make the distinction, as the regulatory response will be quite different. That's the first reason. The second reason, you know, the capacity of many people, including me, I would say, is to accept the fact that our memory is not the best one, I would say, and that from time to time, we are forgetting what happened, not only, I would say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but even some months ago, or at least some years ago. And it's quite strange, my comment, but you will immediately understand why I am elaborated on this, because I think that when we speak about crypto world, it's of course a fast evolving world where the reality today is different from that of tomorrow. Is it something exaggerated to say that there are new acronyms emerging every 6 months? Okay. When I had the pleasure to be elected as chair of FISC, Financial Innovation Standing Committee of FSMA, it was in 2015 for 4 years. At this time, there was an urgency. High on the agenda, we needed to send as soon as possible to the European Commission advice about ICO. Is it a shock if I dare say that ICO are not necessarily in the fashion and that they disappeared from many jurisdictions? Then we had the stable coins, then the NFT for the time being, and of course, decentralized finance. So I think that if you give me 3 minutes in order to explain, I think, what could be an interesting overview of the crypto world, it could be useful for the debate and in order to have reaction from the audience. And if I try to review the crypto world in an increasing order in importance, in terms of market value, but probably also in terms of risk, even if there is not a matching as such about everything. First of all, security tokens, the tokenized assets. I think from this point of view, correct me, Robert, because I know that you want to be precise by definition, of course, it's just another type of security. And the challenge for me is how to allow them in the current financial market infrastructure. That's, I would say, a positive message for financial innovation. And from this point of view, the adoption of what I'm used to calling the well-known European sandbox, the adoption of a DLT pilot regime in the EU is a good step that will allow to expand from a 3-year period. That's for, I would say, the new development about Europe. But in some jurisdictions, like in France, for instance, there are also several experiments with integration of central bank digital currency, for instance, on the French sovereign debt securities. That's for the security tokens, I would say. Then, maybe a little bit more important, at least when we speak about the current market value and in terms of risk, utility tokens. By definition, no unique definition. Mainly, I think what was at the heart of the ICO wave only 3 years ago. ICO most of the time have disappeared. Of course, you can have, I would say, a philosophical approach at a Schumpeter to say, okay, I would say creation, innovation means also destruction. And we could assume the fact that the bad project of the scams have disappeared and only remain, I would say, the solid project to see in the current years. But when you see the wave, I would say, and the hype around ICO, not 10 years ago, not 5 years ago, but only 2 years ago, that's important to recall. Then non-fungible tokens. That's the new hype in hearts. Every week I receive question and demand in Belgium, I would say, small country, in order to give, I would say, comment about NFT project. You know, what does it mean? Underlying is indeed not fungible piece of art, but the tokens, probably you see some question and maybe many cases of misqualification. Stablecoin, for group of crypto. area where I think there are currently probably more risk in terms of financial stability. To some extent, Robert, there can be some similarity with MMF and bank deposits. At the same time, the value of stablecoin is still reasonable, but doesn't mean that nobody was aware and didn't decide to launch working. And when we see, I would say, what are the work streams for the time being at international level, I think that we see that stablecoin has attracted the attention of regulators, policymakers around the world. Papers by CPMI, IOSCO, FSB, of course, the EU MiCA proposal from a negative point of view, because the starting point of MiCA, see how to find, I would say, again, possible gain of money laundering to some extent, and the well-known US report on stablecoin. Just one thing, I remember the first discussion that we had at FSB level in many different work streams, and I had to replace Ashley Alder as chair of IOSCO for different meetings at FSB level. At this time, the discussion was in the canton de Zug in Switzerland, with the announcement of the launch of a new project called at this time Libra. So the demand received by our colleague from Switzerland, FSMA, it was only 2 years ago. 2 years ago. And then you know what happens with the withdrawal of the demand and then switch to California for participation. And I don't have, of course, to comment what happened for the moment with Meta. When we see that, you could say, okay, is it worthwhile to start very, very important work stream? Because frankly speaking, something which is always fascinating for me is to see when we are asked to react as regulators supervise. I think that most of the time there are three possibilities. Subprime, lessons to be learned from a crisis. Very important exercise, but post factum, I would say. Then a positive one, the demand-driven exercise for regulator. That's exactly what happens when we speak about the exciting journey relating to sustainable finance. There is no crisis. There is no new product, just an incredible demand coming not only from sophisticated investors, but also from John and Mary industry. And last but not least, and that's, I think, the case when we speak about crypto, a product-driven agent. And when we see what happens, I would say, the different kind of ways, the fact that it only in 2 or 3 years, a very important issue has clearly disappeared from the stage, the question could be, is it meaningful to start? I think that the one answer would say no. I think that we need to be on board because by definition, there is, I would say, a building blocks between all these aspects. And this is certainly the case for the last crypto, which is the most important, I would say, high in the agenda, the crypto money, Bitcoin and Co. According to leading academics, there was a very interesting paper published by the well-known European Money and Finance Forum, SUEF, published by 3 academics. And according to leading academics, it means virtual object with no intrinsic value as such. What does it mean? High risk for investor, a fact that has prompted supervisor to issue many risk money at national, at EU, at international level. Then some people, I would say, not behind the curve, but decided to take the first step as pioneer. And it means some supervisor who decide to go further by banning the sales to the public of financial product whose value depends on crypto money. It's difficult for me, and I'm sorry for the kind of arrogance. I think that the Belgium FSMA was the first one to ban, I would say, investment of derivated using crypto money as underlying. It was 7 years ago, and we had the pleasure to see that a British colleague from the FSMA decided also to implement exactly more or less the same banning in 2020. AMLD rules in application in EU, MiCA to come, but also that's maybe something new, I would say, even in the financial discussion, I would say many doubts expressed around the sustainability, not only from an SSG point of view of Bitcoin, which highlights the risk related to slow but progressive legitimacy, again, the policy note of Suez and of course the column published recently by Paul Crum are very interesting from this point of view. So it means more and more countries now banning crypto mining for this reason and other reason of crypto holding. At the same time, from the prudential side, the Basel Committee proposal, that's the first time, and I think that's very important, for prudential treatment with the so-called full capital coverage. And maybe something interesting from the side of the behavior of the retail consumer. And we know that by definition, we all three, Nick, Robert, and myself, are too old. At least we are more than 30 years old. And we know that by definition, especially young people would like to invest in this kind of new frontiers. And there is something I think very interesting, but it doesn't mean that we have to stop our work stream. At the contrary, in one reason, in fact, I think that most crypto retail traders in the EU seems to be cautious. Our Dutch colleague and friends from the IMF published some months ago an interesting study. 2/3 of the more than 1 million Dutch citizens who hold crypto have less than 2,500 euros. So you can understand, I don't have official figure for Belgium, but according to some blogs, I think that we are not far from this. So it means that I would say, if we have a look, pay attention to this the figures, it means that only a small majority say that they are taking a gamble. And it means that it's only a limited part of investment. And when we see that, for instance, in the Netherlands, that 2/3 of the 1 million Dutch people who hold crypto has less than 2,500 euro, that's interesting to see. But it can, of course, lead to, I would say, a lot of destruction of value. And that's the reason why we have to be on board for new development. New development, as you stress in the question, Nick, it means MiCA, but there are also, I would say, new measure in interpretation of MiCA. And I think one of the key aspects of our job as conduct supervisor is to be there when you need to be there. And it means also to control ex ante as much as possible. Of course, we need to be very professional, to be very fast in the capacity to check ex ante. And I'm very glad to see that there are many measures taken at domestic level. So that's interaction with the international level to curb the advertising promotion of crypto to the general public. I presume there is a one-page in the Financial Times about the fantastic initiative taken by the CNMV in Spain, but also in the UK with an interesting paper of 200 pages. In Singapore, about Singapore issued guidelines to discourage cryptocurrency trading by general public. In Belgium, we also launch a debate, and we lobbied in order at the level of the government in order to have a draft bill as soon as possible for the Belgian Parliament. And there, of course, it's not a surprise that you could expect by definition that I would say in the future, and maybe also at short term, that you could expect some new warnings at all levels in the pipeline about risk on investing in crypto. So you see, I'm not sure to think, I would say, that we are able to cover everything. It is the best idea. I think that we have to distinguish different kind of crypto and then to come back with the most appropriate toolkit for that.
Thank you very much. You covered a lot of issues, Jean-Paul. I do want to bring Robert back in to respond to anything you've heard, of course. But also at the end, Jean-Paul made an interesting segue into the retail investor space. And I want to take that maybe potentially beyond the crypto space as well, Robert, in your response, because I remember last year you were one of the first to express concerns about GameStop and the implications of that at this conference. And I think we had Verena speak a bit earlier about concerns about gamification and herd behavior in social media. And I think it's true. That's more really where the individual member states come in with their consumer protection policies to some extent. How do you see it? So as I say, respond to anything that Jean-Paul Servais said, but how do you see that relationship between the retail investor and these technological developments, given the potential asymmetry of information?
It's a difficult question. I will address it, but just before that, a very quick word on the way we address the crypto issues in France. We have been very prudent in this domain, awaiting a much dire, I would say, much dire needed EU framework. And we have just, but we have done that. We have just required entities providing digital asset services to French customers. That's a retail aspect. To register with the French authority, with the French AMF. And we have around 30 of them currently registered. It allows us to identify the operators, to know them, who they are, and check that the managers are fit and proper, and that they comply with the AML regulation, and to keep a public whitelist of registered intermediaries in that field that is intended for retail customers, and avoid having them trading with non-registered intermediaries. You actually beyond this crypto world, it's clear that digitalization and platformization of retail trading is developing rapidly, and it's a real challenge for customers and supervisors. And to say the least, I should say the EU framework is not fit for that. In financial services, the basic principle in the EU is the freedom to provide them mainly through the passporting process, which is basically a very straightforward notification of providing the services in a country. Until now, cross-border services were mainly a matter of professionals and wholesale transactions. With the digitalization and platformization of financial services, services for retail becomes more and more cross-border, as Jean-Paul has highlighted. And neo-broker are a good example of that. You have mentioned GameStop. In the European landscape, we have 30 national competent authority, if I take the EEA perimeter. And the supervisory responsibility almost exclusively is in the hand of the home supervisors. It means that when a retail customer complains about the service provided by an institution which is not located in its own country, he should or she should turn to the home supervisor, to the home ombudsman, to the home courts, probably in a foreign language. So it's an impossible task. It is all the more disturbing that in some cases, the financial service provider has just settled in a jurisdiction where he has almost no customer base. And the EU framework, I should say, fosters forum shopping in that sense. So I should think we have a problem. And we have a problem which is mainly in front of us, because this cross-border, this digitalization, we are just at the beginning of this process. And to some extent, it's a welcome process, because there is more competition. Cost should be lower for the end customer, and that's an issue. I will be very blunt. My solution is well known. I think we should have a single supervisory mechanism for financial markets activities, the way we have a SSM for banking activities. And the SSM, it was one of the trigger of it was just cross-border activities of banks. And I do think that at some point there will be the need to have the same type of construction vision in the financial market activities. And because the current structure is no longer fit for the purpose with the development of cross-border digital market activities.
And you're not the first one who said this in this conference. An MEP Stices yesterday called for a European conduct regulator in this area, which led to quite some press reports afterwards. So you might get some as well again, Robert. But if I take this step forward in its logic, it then raises a number of interesting questions. One is around how do you match that with still very domestic consumer protection rules, which has really led to a fragmentation of the retail market and financial services. We really don't have an integrated retail financial services market, but only really a wholesale market. And even that has got kind of holes in it. And the second,
do you really think we need a national approach for consumer protection?
No, maybe we can do the same as with the SSM. The SSM also has to deal with national specificities, but it makes it in the conduct space much more complicated, of course. So I think my feeling is, yes, you would need a bit more harmonization to give that conduct regulator a bit more comfort, no?
I totally concur with that.
That would be a challenge because you have to convince your justice ministries, but that's a footnote.
It's not for tomorrow. That's
yeah. No.
But nevertheless, we should have that in mind.
Yes. No, I agree. We need a vision. I think the other thing is, which I want to come to, what does that mean for the challenges of supervision? Because even if you've got a single supervisor, it's a market that's evolving very quickly. One big outcome of this conference has been that you can create a regulatory framework, but actually the responsibility that falls on the supervisors day to day to make the rules work in a digital environment are becoming much more important. The burden on the supervisors becomes bigger, and the supervisors have to have more flexibility and capability to respond. So how do you deal with that?
Let me just say a few words about that, because it's a challenge for both the host supervisor and the home supervisor. The home supervisor should supervise the entity as an entity providing services European-wide. And to some extent, it's a bit different than just supervising an entity with just local customers. And the host supervisor should be aware of the activities of this entity in its own jurisdiction, which is actually not the case. I have no clue on the activities of the services provided in France, or very little, by entities located in another EU country. For example, currently, it's a bit problematic, I should say.
No, I understand. What's the role for ESMA then? We've had this debate. I'm jumping a bit now on delegation in the fund management industry, for example. We're having this debate in outsourcing. We find it in different areas. So how can ESMA, as an intermediate step to maybe getting a final conduct regulator at some stage as a vision, how do we strengthen the capabilities of ESMA in the interim?
Jean-Paul, you know that you will be vocal on that.
I wanted to bring Jean-Paul in because Jean-Paul also
I'm sure
how the FSMA is reforming itself to respond to the crisis. So I leave it to both of you to respond.
No, the answer is supervisory convergence. That's the message which have been sent by the co-legislators until now. The problem is supervisory convergence, coordination between all of us. It's time-consuming. You need the staffing in order to do that, and it's not the case currently.
Yeah. No, I take your point. Yeah, Jean-Paul, come in, please.
Two comments, if I may, about the architecture of cross-border supervision at EU level and about the toolkit. Nick, I don't have to tell you the European passport is one of the most powerful ID if you want to support the European ID. And I strongly believe, as you can see, I have two flags behind me, the Belgian and European one. And like in France, we are well known in order to be, I would say, there whenever we can be helpful in order to develop our EU approach. When I have the pleasure, and it's the case for many other people in the audience, and more due to the fact that with Teams, Zooms, we have fantastic outreach night and day, even outside Europe. And we thought going outside of building, when I have the pleasure to explain what it means, UCITS 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 passport in Asia, most of the time people ask me, can you repeat it? Does it mean that one home country can deliver a passport and then the UCITS can be distributed without any additional cost, fees, additional passport, additional... Can you repeat it? Because many of my colleagues and friends in Asia don't know that. And that's something that exists in Europe for more than 20 years. Fantastic idea. I would say that the UCITS market is maybe the most integrated internal market. But European passport is not only a fantastic idea, but can be also a danger for the retailers if we don't have, as stressed by Robert, supervisory convergence, and that we have the appropriate balance between home and host, especially when only a limited part of product approved in a home country are not sold in this country but elsewhere. That's, I would say, the challenge. I strongly believe in the capacity of ESMA, EIOPA, ecosystem. I don't speak about EBA because the FSMA is not member of EBA, and that's it, because we are in a Twin Peaks model in Belgium, like in many other countries. But it's not in order to say that's the best model. I would say there is no lessons to be learned from that. Everything depends on national aspect for the choice of the landscape for this issue. But let us be clear, European passport can be also very dangerous if we don't have a balanced architecture. And if you match that with the kind of toolkit we need for platformization, you need, of course, to start with the, I would say, the starting point. What does it mean, a platform in financial markets? Of course, tech-driven, but also network effect. Let us be clear. And that's maybe, if I may, Robert, we need also to be active for this aspect at national level. Of course, it means also third characteristic, different kind of several elastic structure. And then the last point for me, which is a characteristic of this rather unique approach, if we want to be able to supervise platform in financial market, that's what I'm used to calling the disruptive dimension. Because we all know that platforms scale efficiently by eliminating intermediate throws, orchestration of resources, favorization of external interaction, focusing on ecosystem, or in other words, it's quite strange, but I think that's an appropriate approach and definition, to re-intermediate by putting themselves in the center. So there is no more distance between, I would say, the platform and the retail, but they are in the center. And therefore, we need also, I think, to be on board at national level, because when we see the difference after the GameStop story, the day that, okay, there were first discussion in the US, I asked to my staff in Belgium, small country, not the biggest one at international level, but I think an open economy and with a good diversification investment. Belgian people like to invest in different kind of assets. I check, frankly speaking, people, and that's thanks to the new development about the quality of database like MIFIR, MIFID, and EMIR. We had a very good idea, not of course the most precise one, but we were able to cover, I would say, an overview of the interest, of the absence of interest for GameStop for retail investors in Belgium. What I can tell you, and I already explained that in Belgium and even international last year, it was not material at all, let us be clear. If we use, I would say, the regulated aspect. We check Reddit if there was some issue about, I would say, Belgium shares. And so it means that I think that we still need, for some aspect, to have, I would say, a national approach, because big term platforms have so far not been very active in EU financial market, with the exception of payment. And if you have a look on the different kind of platforms that we have, for instance, in a country like Belgium, but it's not only Belgium, it's the case to say for other EU countries. It means most of the time crowdfunding platform, super apps offered by banks with reporting, oversight, and then tricky issue, oversight of consumer purchase behavior. What does it mean? So that's a tricky aspect and a point of vantage. Online brokers, most of the time, very interesting to see that most of the time, this new world, most of the time only offers investment in ETF. Interesting to know. And other players also, and I don't have the intention to quote and of to name some players, a kind of Robin Hood Kindish business model. And then last but not least, new strategic partnership between telecommunication company and classical banks. That's for, I would say, the supply. But if we have a look on the investor side, also very interesting to see, and I think from this point of view, Nick, that there are something special, or some rather unique characteristic. And even when I see the situation all around Belgium, I'm not sure that we have the same kind of market. But what we can see, it's a new powerful cohort of retail investors who emerge and who coordinate over social media platform, message board, and also reveal their own financial transaction out in for the open for their peers to see. Something quite strange. At the time of GDPR, you would expect that people protect their privacy. Most of the time, it's something interesting. Well, okay, I'm used to go also in the detail as national supervisor. It's also the behavior about their own. So there is a total transparency. And of course, this new phenomenon has been amplified by the well-known meme stock trading frenzy beginning last year. By definition, people supporting CMU like Robert and myself would say, of course, it's a good development, especially in Europe, where people might maybe too much invested in safe product. But the question is to see to which extent this trend is sustainable in the long term. And you know that it's not necessarily the case when you have a look on the new update published recently, and avoid that investing is mixed with gambling, especially for the young generation discovering investment for the first time. And that's also, I would say, very important. And when we see also what it means for us, the point of attention for the supply side, conflict of interest in business model, possible complexity of investment product, how to buy 1/10 of a share. Is it so easy to understand for a non-sophisticated investor? Not at all. I can tell you, I have the pleasure to give lecture every Saturday at the University of Brussels. You don't have to think that new investors have this capacity to understand this complexity, and that's the same for the complex derivative product. And also the risk that the interaction of social media platform exists with financial platform, and that could have systemic impact, and also about the trust in the capacity of the financial system to provide for financial services and to offer financial products which are clearly matched with the profile of investors. For the demand side, I would say, where do people get information? Increasing all for social media with a rapid evolution. And of course, I would say the risk education, and you know that and every day in my life, I try to take initiative about financial education. This is, in fact, Nick, as you know, the first time that in a paper published by the European Commission about CMU, there are comments and support for financial education. Correct me, but I think that's the first time the European Commission speak without legal basis, because you know most of the time it's linked with subsidiary principle. And that's, I think, a fantastic support for taking initiative. Again, I think that from this point of view, financial education needs also to be there at a national level and in order to complement traditional supervisory activities.
Thank you very much indeed. It's always interesting speaking to the two of you because I feel I go away often with more questions than answers. You've kind of opened things up, so to speak. One will be, for example, how we talk about supervision and how we still encourage some form of specialization between different markets or supervisors within the new framework. I know, Jean-Paul, you also want to talk about what the FSMA is doing internally about data analytics and building up. I think we might come back to that if you allow me, because I'm a bit conscious of time. But Robert, I just wanted to give you a chance in case there's any last thoughts from your side.
Nothing specific, but just coming back to what I said at the beginning of this session. We are just at the beginning of a long journey, and the challenges we are still facing are not yet properly covered. I do hope that in the next few years we will be up to our task and deliver on this issue, having the right balance between fostering innovation and ensuring confidence in the financial markets, which is a tricky balance to achieve, indeed.
Those who lived through, and that's the benefit of being older than 30 years, having lived through the dot-com bubble, for example, confidence can be wiped out overnight and takes decades to rebuild. I think it's a very important point you make, Robert, and we're in a very dangerous space here potentially if we kind of let things develop in one or the other direction without keeping an eye on things. I really found this highly interesting. I also always enjoy speaking to the two of you. Thank you very much for being with us. And Jean-Paul, you can rest assured, so can you, Robert, that you certainly will be asked to join and hopefully can join again next year.